A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
If you ask the average person on the street to name a Jewish language, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say Yiddish. Maybe they will mention Hebrew if they are thinking about the Bible or modern Israel. But Yiddish is the one that has really captured the popular imagination. It is the language of Fiddler on the Roof, the language of comedy clubs, and the language of grandparents in Brooklyn. But here is the thing that floored me when I was looking into today's prompt from Daniel. If you think Yiddish is the definitive Jewish language, you are actually missing the vast majority of the historical data. For a massive chunk of history, Yiddish was not the dominant Jewish tongue. In fact, if you look at the total number of speakers over the last 2,000 years, more Jews have actually spoken Arabic as their primary language than Yiddish.
It really shifts your perspective when you look at the raw data. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been diving into the linguistic history of the diaspora all morning because Daniel really hit on something profound here. We have this Yiddish-centric view of Jewish history because of the massive Ashkenazi population in Europe leading up to the 20th century, but that is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in the grand scheme of things. If you wind the clock back to around the year 800, nearly all of the world's Jewish population lived within the Islamic Empire. They were native Arabic speakers. We are talking about millions of people across North Africa, the Levant, Iraq, and even Spain, all communicating, writing philosophy, and doing business in what we now call Judeo-Arabic. Language is the primary technology of cultural survival in the diaspora, and understanding these fusion dialects reveals how Jewish identity was engineered across centuries.
That is a staggering figure. It means that for several centuries, the center of gravity for Jewish life was entirely within the Arabic-speaking world. But when we say Judeo-Arabic, are we talking about a completely different language, or is it just Arabic with a few Hebrew words sprinkled in? I know you have a specific technical framework for this, Herman.
That brings us to what linguists often call the Jewish language blueprint. It is a modular system, almost like a software architecture that repeats itself across almost every Jewish community in the diaspora. You start with the host country's vernacular, like Arabic or Spanish or German. That is your base layer. Then you infuse it with a heavy layer of Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary, specifically for religious, legal, and communal concepts. But the real kicker, the cultural firewall as I like to think of it, is the orthography. These languages were almost always written in the Hebrew alphabet. It did not matter if the spoken language was a dialect of German or a dialect of Arabic, it was transcribed using Hebrew characters.
So, picture someone in 10th century Baghdad writing a letter that sounds like the local Arabic dialect. But if a non-Jewish neighbor looked at the page, they could not read a single word because it was all in Hebrew letters?
That was the strategy. It served a dual purpose. On one hand, it allowed for high levels of literacy within the community because every Jewish boy learned the Hebrew alphabet for prayer and Torah study. On the other hand, it kept the community's internal communications private. It created a distinct space where they could participate in the broader culture while maintaining a separate identity. Maimonides is the perfect anchor for this. He is arguably the most influential Jewish philosopher in history, and his masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Judeo-Arabic. The original title was Dalalat al-Harin. If you saw the original manuscript, it looks like Hebrew, but if you read it out loud, you are speaking medieval Arabic.
It is incredible to think about Maimonides, this pillar of Jewish thought, writing his most famous work in a language that most modern Jews can't even identify, let alone read. It makes me wonder why Yiddish eventually took over the top spot in our collective memory. Was it just a matter of population growth in Eastern Europe?
A few factors played into that. The Ashkenazi population exploded in the 19th century. By 1939, there were somewhere between 11 and 13 million Yiddish speakers worldwide. That is a massive concentration of people using the same tongue at a time when global communication was becoming more standardized. But we have to remember that Yiddish followed the same blueprint we just talked about. It started in the Rhine Valley around the 9th or 10th century as a fusion of High German with Hebrew and Aramaic. As those communities moved east into Poland and Russia, they added Slavic elements. But they never stopped writing it in Hebrew letters. It is that persistence of the writing system that I find so compelling. It is like the operating system remains the same even when the hardware changes.
Moving on to something else Daniel mentioned in the prompt, which is Ladino. I have always heard of it as this beautiful romantic language of the Sephardic Jews, but I did not realize it was essentially a time capsule.
Linguists often call it a living fossil. Ladino, or Judesmo as many speakers call it, emerged after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. When King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella forced the Jewish population out, those families carried 15th century Castilian Spanish with them to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, and eventually to the Americas. Because they were separated from the linguistic evolution of mainland Spain, they preserved features of the language that have been dead for 500 years in Madrid or Mexico City.
So, a Ladino speaker from the early 20th century would sound like they stepped out of a medieval play to a modern Spanish speaker.
Pretty much. They use verb forms and pronunciations that disappeared from modern Spanish centuries ago. For example, the letter J in modern Spanish has that raspy, guttural sound, like in the word Jose. But in Ladino, they often preserve the old esh or z sound. What makes it a true Jewish language, though, is how it adapted to its new homes. If you look at Ladino from Salonika, which was the great Sephardic center in the Ottoman Empire, it is full of Turkish words for household items and Greek words for maritime concepts, all layered over that archaic Spanish base. And once again, it was written in the Hebrew script, specifically a cursive variant called soletreo, or the block year Rashi characters.
That mention of Salonika brings up a darker point in this history. We talk about these languages as living things, but many of them are on life support. The Holocaust did not just kill people, it nearly wiped out entire linguistic ecosystems. I read that the Sephardic community of Salonika was almost entirely murdered by the Nazis. What does that do to a language like Ladino?
It was catastrophic. You lose the critical mass of speakers needed for a language to evolve naturally. When you lose 95% of a city's population, the language stops being spoken in the markets and the schools. It becomes a language of the home, then a language of the grandparents, and eventually it becomes an academic curiosity. The same thing happened to Yiddish, of course. 1/3 of the world's Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and they were overwhelmingly Yiddish speakers. The language lost its center of gravity in Eastern Europe in a single decade.
Then there is the other side of the story, which is the mass migration in the late 1940s and 50s. When the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews left countries like Iraq, Egypt, and Morocco to move to Israel or France or the United States, they often stopped speaking Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Persian to assimilate. Why did these languages struggle to survive the move to Israel? One would think a Jewish state would be the perfect place for them to flourish.
One would think so, but the early Zionist project was very focused on the negation of the diaspora. They wanted to create a new Jew who was strong, rooted in the land, and spoke the revived modern Hebrew. The diaspora languages, whether it was Yiddish or Judeo-Arabic, were seen by many as symbols of exile and weakness. There were actually posters in early Israel that said, "Hebrew speaker, speak Hebrew." There was a lot of social pressure to drop the old dialects. We talked about the engineering of modern Hebrew back in episode 1037, and a big part of that was intentionally replacing this tapestry of diaspora languages with a single, unified tongue. It was a nation-building strategy, but it came at a high cultural cost.
There is a real sense of loss there, even if the goal was national unity. We are talking about losing thousands of years of nuance, but I do not want to make it sound like it is all doom and gloom. Daniel's prompt got me looking into the modern status of these languages, and there are some surprising success stories. You look at Brooklyn today, and Yiddish isn't just surviving, it is booming.
Hasidic communities are the standout exception. For them, Yiddish isn't a historical curiosity, it is the primary language of daily life. There are roughly 85,000 people in New York City who report Yiddish as their home language, and those numbers are growing because the birth rates in those communities are so high. They have Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish podcasts, Yiddish children's books. It is a completely organic, living language that is evolving to include words for things like cell phones and the internet. Since the pandemic, we have also seen a massive surge in secular Yiddish learning. Organizations like YIVO have seen record-breaking registrations for online courses. People are hungry for that connection.
It is wild to imagine a 16th century German dialect having a word for a smartphone. But what about the others? Is there a Ladino version of Brooklyn?
Not quite. Ladino is much more endangered. There are maybe 160,000 to 200,000 speakers left, mostly elderly people in Israel and Turkey. The European Parliament even published a briefing in 2023 specifically highlighting Ladino as an endangered language in Europe. But there is this fascinating cultural revival happening. You mentioned the Beavis Ladino High School Club of America, which was started by teenagers in Florida in 2022. There are university programs at places like the University of Washington and Harvard that are digitizing old Ladino newspapers and letters. It is becoming a heritage language that younger people are reclaiming to connect with their ancestry. Even in 2026, as we look toward the 250th anniversary of the United States, there is a renewed interest in the Sephardic Jewish history of the American Revolution and the language they brought with them.
I want to look at one of the lesser-known examples that caught my eye in the research, Judeo-Persian. We usually think of the Jewish world as being divided between Ashkenazi and Sephardic, but the Persian Jewish community is one of the oldest in the world. They have been in that region since the Babylonian exile.
Their speech reflects that incredible depth of history. Judeo-Persian is one of the oldest attested Jewish diaspora languages. We have documents in Hebrew script, Persian dating back to the 8th century. What is truly cool about Judeo-Persian is its literary tradition. In the 14th century, you had poets like Shaheen-e-Shirazi, who were writing epic biblical stories, like the life of Moses, but they were writing them in the style of classical Persian poetry, like the Shahnameh. It is an amazing synthesis where the form is Persian and the content is Jewish, and it is all held together by those Hebrew characters. Today, there are still about 60,000 speakers, mostly in the Iranian diaspora in Los Angeles and Israel, but it is definitely considered endangered as the younger generation moves towards standard Farsi or English.
It highlights how Jews weren't just isolated in a ghetto. They were deeply integrated into the high culture of whatever empire they were living in. They were just doing it in their own specific way. But then you look at something like Judeo-Italian, and it is the opposite extreme. I saw a statistic that there are only about 200 speakers left.
It is on the brink. Judeo-Italian was once a flourishing set of dialects across the Italian peninsula. The oldest known text is from the 11th century. It was centered in Rome for a long time. But as Italy unified and Standard Italian became the norm, and as the Jewish community assimilated after the ghettos were opened, the language just faded away. When you get down to 200 or 250 speakers, you are at a point where the language could disappear entirely in a single generation.
This raises a point about what happens when a language fades. It is not just the words you lose, it is the specific way of looking at the world. If you can't read Judeo-Arabic, you can't really access the world of Maimonides in its original context. You are reading a translation of a thought process that was originally happening in a very specific linguistic space.
You lose the deeper nuances. Every language has these built-in assumptions and metaphors. In Judeo-Arabic, the religious vocabulary is often shared with Islam, but with a Jewish twist. When you lose that, you lose the ability to see how those two cultures actually interacted and influenced each other on a granular level. It is like trying to understand a piece of software by looking at the user interface instead of the source code. The Jewish language system was the source code for diaspora life. When that code is lost, the nuances of the literature and the communal logic become inaccessible.
Looking at this today, is that blueprint still relevant, or are we just seeing it evolve into something else? I mean, think about the way Jewish communities in America use English. We have words like chutzpah or mensch that have entered the mainstream. But there is also a specific way of speaking in certain communities that feels like a new version of the system.
Linguists have a term for this. They call it Jewish English. It follows the same pattern, English grammar and vocabulary as the base, a heavy infusion of Hebrew and Yiddish loanwords for religious and social life, and sometimes even a specific intonation that mirrors the logic of Talmudic study. It doesn't use the Hebrew alphabet for writing, which is a major departure from the historical system, but the psychological mechanism is the same. It is about creating a linguistic home that feels distinct from the surrounding culture. It is a portable homeland. When you don't have a territory, your language becomes your territory.
That is a powerful image. It is the one thing you can take with you when you have to leave Spain in 1492 or Iraq in 1950. But it makes me wonder about the role of technology in all of this. We are in 2026 now, and AI translation has become incredibly sophisticated. Do you think things like the Jewish Language Project or digital archiving can actually save these languages? Or are they just building a museum?
It is a mix of both. AI is a double-edged sword here. On one hand, it can help us decode and translate massive amounts of Solitreo or Judeo-Arabic manuscripts that have been sitting in basements for centuries. It can make these lost worlds accessible to people who don't have 10 years to spend learning a dead dialect. Projects like JewishLanguages.org are the modern equivalent of the medieval scribe, preserving the data before it vanishes. On the other hand, a language only stays alive if people are actually using it to talk about their day, argue with their kids, and tell jokes. You can't really automate that.
Using AI to bridge that gap is a fascinating prospect. Imagine a large language model trained specifically on the corpus of Judeo-Arabic literature that could help a researcher in Jerusalem understand a fragment from the Cairo Geniza in seconds. That is a massive force multiplier for historical research. It is like we are finally getting the tools to read the data we have been collecting for 1,000 years.
The Cairo Geniza perfectly illustrates this. For those who don't know, it was a storeroom in a synagogue in Old Cairo where the community deposited any scrap of paper that had writing on it, because you weren't supposed to throw away anything that might contain the name of God. Because they used the Hebrew script for everything, shopping lists, legal contracts, personal letters, marriage certificates, it all ended up in the Geniza. We have hundreds of thousands of fragments that give us a high-definition picture of daily life in the medieval Mediterranean, and almost all of it is in Judeo-Arabic. It is the world's most fascinating trash can.
It really backs up Daniel's point. If you looked at that trash can in the year 1100, you would never guess that Yiddish would one day be seen as the quintessential Jewish language. You would think the future of the Jewish people was entirely intertwined with the Arabic language. It is a reminder of how much of our history is shaped by where we happen to be standing at the moment. It really challenges the Ashkenazi normative view of history.
Right. When we talk about Jewish culture, we tend to think of Eastern Europe, but for the vast majority of our history, the action was happening in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. The languages we spoke reflect that. Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Greek. These aren't just footnotes, they are the main text for huge swaths of time. Jewishness has always been modular and adaptive. We don't just adopt a culture, we adapt it. We take the language of the people around us, and we re-engineer it to serve our own communal needs.
It is a survival strategy. If you can change your language without losing your core identity, you can survive almost anything. But it does feel like we are at a unique moment where that diversity is narrowing. With the dominance of modern Hebrew in Israel and English in the diaspora, we are moving toward a more monolingual Jewish world than we have had in 2,000 years. Does the blueprint become obsolete when you are fully integrated into a Western democracy?
That is the central question moving forward. I suspect we will always find a way to tweak the language. It is just in the DNA of how these communities function. Whether it is through specific loanwords or unique intonations, the need to mark a linguistic boundary remains. I encourage everyone listening to look into the Jewish language history in their own families. You might find that your great-grandparents weren't just speaking a broken version of a local language, but were actually participating in the 1,000-year-old tradition of linguistic engineering.
It makes me want to dig into my own family history to see if there are any hidden linguistic fossils. You never know what you might find when you stop looking at everything through a Yiddish-only lens. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I think it really puts a lot of the topics we have covered into a much broader context. If you want to hear more about the specific evolution of the Hebrew script itself, you should definitely check out episode 1031, where we talked about the transition from Paleo-Hebrew to the block letters we use today.
That fits perfectly with this because the visual look of the language is such a big part of that firewall we were talking about. It is the clothes the language wears, as we put it in that episode.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground, from Baghdad to Brooklyn. It really makes you appreciate the sheer linguistic creativity of people trying to keep their culture alive across the centuries. Before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives into the linguistic source code without that kind of technical support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these explorations valuable, a quick review on your favorite podcast app is the best way to help other curious minds find the show. You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all our subscription links.
We will be back next time with another deep dive into whatever curiosity Daniel sends our way. Until then, stay curious.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth.